Now, once you have defined the scope for the assessment, here is the methodology that you could use, that we would advocate using with SAM. The approach that's presented here is intended to be generic. So this is a repeatable process, but as an organization, feel free to adapt it and decide what each of the steps means in the context of your organization and just go ahead with that. Now, the key part of this process is understanding and defining your scopes, as I've already mentioned that. You might decide to do an assessment per line of business or per product owner. What you're looking to have, though, is a consistent approach across the organization. So when you stack the assessments across one another, you can easily compare them as in apples to apples. It wouldn't be reasonable to say that in this area, we're going to do these two lines of businesses together, but in this other product area, we're going to do them on product basis, because then your comparisons won't make any sense. So whenever you're going to do an assessment, it is a great idea, for instance, to create a brief summary with a slide or a quick email to say, this is how we're going to do the assessment. In each case, you need to emphasize who the right stakeholders are and how to involve them in the assessment. Typically, you want to consider the questions you are going to talk about. Say you want to start with 2 one-hour sessions and you'd like to talk about governance and design. Think about those questions and collaborate with the team leads involved to make sure that you're going to have in the room or on the call the people who can meaningfully contribute to answering the questions. So the idea here is to minimize the number of times someone says, oh, Seba is the one who knows the answer to that question, but he's on leave today. So you want to be able to have that momentum within the session that when you're looking at the questions and at the quality criteria, the people in the room are the right stakeholders to be answering, are we doing that? Note that as you go from session to session in the assessment, the composition might change a little bit. So for governance, you might need different set of stakeholders versus verification. Now, in the assessment, you want to be able to go through all practices. There are 3 practices with 2 streams and 3 maturity levels. And as I've mentioned, there are 90 questions in total to discuss. This is obviously not something you can do in one 45-minute meeting. It's going to be necessary to give the teams time to work through those questions. My experience is that even if you do get all the right people in the room, don't expect a solid answer to each question during the meeting. So it's a good idea to schedule the sessions several days apart. In some cases, the teams will realize the fact that they need to do more homework to come up with a definitive answer to a certain question. Note that it is a great starting point to ask your team to go through this SAM training or attend an in-person one-day training in order for them to understand what this whole thing is all about. If that's not an option, typically due to timing constraints, it is critical to give them some of that information in perhaps a shorter session or in writing. The amount of time you want to spend on explaining the model is up to you in that case. Now, the purpose of all of this is to understand where you are, but in order to aim for an improvement. A point-in-time score for SAM doesn't really give you a nice shiny star nor certification. It's not also an audit, it's a starting point. So you don't gain much in figuring out your starting point unless you are going to embark on an improvement path. That is where the value of doing SAM comes in. Where do we see getting ourselves in 6 months or in 12 months? So you could get a target score, whether that's an overall score or a focus on a specific practice where you want to go from, for instance, 0.9 to 1.3. Now, knowing where you want to get, the team can start working out a plan. What are the changes we need to make to make our answer go from no to at least yes for some or yes for most. Once the team understands that these are the things we need to put in place in order to change that answer, those are the things you need to do. Generally speaking, it's always a good idea to start with an early adopter and work through how is this going to work in our business as usual processes. Capture that and say, this is how we're going to do that in practice within this group. For instance, consider threat modeling. You decide to start in the next sprint to threat model one application. You will allow yourself to get it running in specific teams and then streamline it from there. Once you have it going in a smaller pilot group, you can now roll out the improvements to the rest of the applications. And after 5-6 months, you can look back at the question and, knowing the updated processes at your company, assess whether or not you are doing this activity, and hopefully for most of the applications.